Hey, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. My name is Matt Helmers, faculty member in the Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department at Iowa State University, director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and also faculty involved with the Iowa Learning Farms. And as I've told many times, this is one of the highlights of my week, is to get to help moderate the webinar for the Iowa Learning Farms. And we are really fortunate. I'm super excited today to welcome a close colleague and friend to the Iowa Learning Farm webinar series. And so Dr. Raj Raman is a Morrill professor in the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering here at Iowa State University and the project director of RegenPGC. So he's going to talk to us today about developing large-scale, reliable perennial ground cover systems, talking about the challenges and approaches. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we will get those to Dr. Raman at the end of his talk. And with that, the virtual floor is all yours, Raj.
Thank you very much, Matt. You can hear me okay?
You're coming through loud and clear.
Great. Liz, Jackie, Elena, the rest of the team that helps put these on, thank you so much for your guidance and hospitality and for inviting me to be here. And everybody's taking time, at least if you're in this part of the upper Midwest. It's a gorgeous day. I saw my neighbor who retired. He's my age. He retired early. He was going out golfing this morning. And I thought maybe that's, not a bad idea for a day like today, but really glad to be with you. And you can see my title here. And I want to acknowledge Ken Moore, Brandon Schlautman, Cindy Bartel, and Sarah Lira. You'll hear more about what their roles are, but they've all in various ways contributed to the slide deck you're going to see today. So without further ado, and realizing we're going to keep this to about 25 minutes, let's go. So actually, this is not the Iowa Learning Farms' first PGC rodeo, as you might say. It turns out that almost 2 years ago, my friend and colleague Cindy Bartel gave a talk, and here's the cover slide that she used. And so she really introduced this idea. I know that there's turnover, and not all of you may have heard her talk, but that is, I think it's recorded and available. And I kind of reviewed her slides when I was making this slide deck, and it's a great presentation she did. I didn't want to really just repeat that. I feel like there's some other things to talk about. She had covered how perennial ground covers can help and how they work and so on. I'm going to focus a little bit on the principle of perennial ground cover systems, but then talk a little bit more about sort of some of our challenges and how we're trying to think about getting to scale on this. So here we go. RegenPGC is the shorthand name for a 5-year multi-institutional USDA NIFA SAS cap that started exactly a year ago, September 2021. That's the full name. I won't read it to you. A NIFA SAS cap, I think in my mind, is the last two parts of that are very important, which is that it's a sustainable agricultural system that's under study, and it's a coordinated agricultural project. It's not just research. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And there's the language that says that anything really silly that I say today, which is entirely possible, is not the USDA's fault. It's my fault. So I wanted to begin by emphasizing what a great team it is that I have the privilege of working with on this project. We think that these perennial ground cover systems do offer a scalable pathway to some critical ecosystem services, but we know they have to be made more reliable before we deploy them widely. And this is a coordinated transdisciplinary effort to do this, to make this possible. And I'm not going to read all the names here, but Ken Moore, Dan Anderson, et al. At multiple institutions: Wisconsin-Madison, Missouri, K-State, Corteva, and so on. The Land Institute. We have a tremendous team here. We've got people focused on 4-H education and FFA education. We have people focused on REU, RET, reaching out to teachers. So the multi-level project. We also have a superb stakeholder advisory board, including people from Field to Market, Gasser Farms, Greenland's Blue Waters, Iowa Soybean, NRCS, NTEP, which is National Turf Grass Evaluation Program, USDA, and Verbio. So we're grateful for all those eyes and on the project and all the hands that we have on this project. Here's the long story short. Cover cropping should be popular. It does a lot of really great things. It isn't that popular. If you look at ERS data, this is starting to get stale, but it's the most recent that I pulled maybe a year ago, 2017. Many of you will be familiar with these kinds of maps, but essentially this is showing by county cover crop adoption, and the reds are above 15%, and you look where most of us are, and there's an awful lot of medium gray, which is 1 to 5%, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of that orange. The number that I hear quoted is around 4% in Iowa is cover cropped. And I am a person who no longer believes that this is simply a lack of know-how. And I think that what you believe about why this is sort of important, because if you say, well, it's just that not enough people know the benefits, that's an argument to really continue to do education on this. And we should certainly continue to do education on annual cover cropping. I don't argue with that. But I feel as though a lot of people who have tried or have considered doing annual cover cropping either have stopped or are not, don't go forward with it because of a combination of tangible and intangible costs to them. The tangible being the what am I actually making or losing on this effort, and the intangible being how is this requiring me to do things at certain times of year when I'm already very busy. I'm not sure that we always capture those things well. And if you ask the question, is there a way of simplifying and reducing the cost of cover cropping while also perennializing the landscape? That we think the answer is yes, and that is the core of this PGC vision. Now I see that the chats are coming in, and having taught, I forget how many total hours, but let's say the better part of 3 semesters online to multiple classes from 50 to 80 students. When I see a chat, I always want to just answer, but I'm not going to. I'm going to get through these slides and then have open conversation. And actually, if Jackie or Matt is that okay with you, or do you want me to stop right now and try to take it?
No, that's right. And Raj, the only one you should be seeing is mine, just telling people to type.
Very good. Okay, very good. I just want to make sure, I don't want people to feel like I'm ignoring their questions. I'm just going to rock and roll through this, and then we'll take on a bunch of questions. So we have this overarching goal to perennialize working lands, improving soil conservation and water quality while maintaining or increasing profitability, enhancing biomass production, and improving the overall system resilience. That is the dream. That's a lot of nice things there. That's unicorns and rainbows. And fundamentally, we're going to achieve that dream, hopefully, by managing the competition between a perennial cover and a row crop. That is the basic idea. So there's this kind of cutaway diagram that Ken Moore had somebody create for us several years ago. And this is, in some idealized version, what is going on. Here's a photograph taken by one of our team members, our commercialization lead, actually, and the quote is hers, 100% perennial cover immediately after harvest. That's was with a cooperating farmer that she was trialing some perennial ground cover with. That's the dream. And if you're saying, well, say that again, okay. In a perennial ground cover system, the cover crop is planted once, but lasts multiple years. That perennial cover crop has to be complementary to the row crop in both time and space. The row crops don't like being crowded. Some of them, like corn in particular, don't even like seeing green nearby. This is a major challenge for our project, quite frankly. And ideally, we would have a perennial cover that was active early season and late season in the Corn Belt, but not particularly vigorous in the middle of the season when our row crops are working hard to make a grain yield. Furthermore, and very confusing, especially to people who are familiar or good at themselves, annual cover cropping. Unlike most annual cover crops, there is not a economic value from harvesting these perennial ground covers. In fact, they yield quite a bit less, fractional ton per acre, compared to a couple of ton per acre for some of the annual cover crops people might plant. The only purpose of this cover is to provide ecosystem services. The value proposition is that it's providing those ecosystem services, and it's perhaps lower cost and lower barrier to entry than some of the alternatives. The prairie ecosystem that existed for thousands of years before it was disturbed by farming had provided all kinds of really great ecosystem services that we don't have in our current annual cropping system. These include continuous soil cover, which leads to reduced soil erosion, reduced water runoff and its cousin, increased infiltration, increased carbon sequestration, improved soil quality. A perennial ground cover approach can function in existing crop rotations. We're not telling people to plant something completely different. It can potentially reduce pesticide requirements and reduce mineral nitrogen losses, and it provides some wildlife habitat and potentially allows for a greater stover harvest. So that's quite a litany of benefits. It really is. And it was the search for those benefits that really motivated people, Ken Moore notably, and his students a decade and a half ago in some of the early work they were doing in these systems. And they showed, this is Dustin Wiggins, Ken Moore, and Kendall Lamke and Singer published this work. And this work is now, right, 14 years old from what was the first experimental year. And what you see here are grain yields in yellow in a control, and then grain yields in green for that same corn planted with fescue, and in brown, that same corn planted with Kentucky bluegrass. And immediately it jumps out that in the first year, things didn't go so well for those perennial ground cover systems. In years 2, 3, and 4, they went much better. It might be attractive to say, oh, so this thing works badly in the first year, but then it works great the following years. No, it's not that simple. The challenge is this: if you don't get good suppression of the cover early season, you lose yield. I think that was a wet year. I've got notes here, but I think that first year was wet and they struggled with suppression. The ground cover did really well early, and they lost yield. In the second, third, and fourth experimental years, they controlled successfully, suppressed the ground cover, and they had great yields. And I'm showing you these data, but these are not the only data from these systems. And when people have run these systems and had good control, and I should be careful, sometimes in that first year, it's not so much control, it's that you planted the ground cover so recently that it hasn't really had time to thrive. So if corn in particular essentially sees a mostly brown background, and corn sees, I mean, it doesn't have eyes like we do, but there are phytochromes, there are molecules in corn that sense color. And if you have a strong green background, if the red far red ratio is in the wrong direction, Corn will assume that there is competition and put resources into growing tall. And I should be careful. Corn isn't the only thing that does this, the only crop that does this, but it does it a lot. And when it puts all that energy into getting tall and trying to outcompete whatever's there, even though that other thing isn't really going to grow to be tall in this case, yields really suffer. So really reiterating what I just said to you, this perennial cover, its role shifts over time. In the fall, it's a cover. In the winter, it's a cover. In the spring, it's a weed, right? It seems like competition. In the summer, it's a mulch. I think I've answered this question for you already, but I'm just going to ask it out loud. I've told you about all these great benefits that will accrue if we do a perennial ground cover, right? And I'm assuming that I don't need to articulate to all of you that many of those benefits of controlling erosion, reducing nutrient export, et cetera, would be a great thing for agriculture in the upper Midwest to do. So you see it's attractive. We've told you it does these great things. We've shown you it could give you competitive yield. It would be very reasonable for you to say, well, why don't you get off your hands and start doing this, right? Why isn't this just a great extension project? I shouldn't say just, but why isn't this a focused extension project? And the answer is there are significant challenges to doing PGC widely, and they are that the system works, but it is very brittle, okay? Those 30, 40, 50% yield losses are the kind of thing that if people experience that on a large fraction of their acres one time, if they stay in business, they're never going to try that again. And so we actually have an interesting situation in my mind that we want people to trial this on little swatches of their land, but we want to be very careful of having people get way in front of where the technology reliability is, because we don't want a lot of nightmare stories out there. We absolutely need producers to partner with us and trial this and share what they learn, and we need to harness all the creativity that's out there in the grower community. There's no doubt about that. But we cannot have people going big right now, because you have to have the wherewithal to watch carefully to make sure that your suppression worked well everywhere. And if it didn't work well, to do something to make a second pass to suppress better. That's probably doable for a lot of people on 2, 3, 4 acres. We think that's not doable for most people at 50, 100, 300 acres. So I can jump to the conclusion right now. What we want to do in this project is develop these systems so that we have confidence that people could do it on 400 acres with a high degree of reliability. That's really the long game that we're in. Fundamentally, a managed competition system, which is what this is more complex than business as usual, where I would argue we really sort of eliminate competition. It's what we try to do in conventional row crop agriculture. We are betting that at this moment in history, we can handle the complexity. That's really the bet that we're making. And we appreciate the USDA taking us up on this and funding us. And we're going to try to work hard and be smart and be a little lucky and make this happen. We know that risk management is critical to farmers. And as of today, a perennial ground cover approach has greater risks. We think we can reduce those risks through a coordinated research, extension, education, and commercialization program. And that is exactly what we're spending the people's money on this project. So we want to maintain and increase production. We want to maintain or increase farm income and profitability. We want to have marginal impacts on time and other resources. And in fact, we have to have marginal impacts, because if we do a proper budget and we're interested, if we want to help profitability and we're requiring 200 extra hours of time, you can't get there from here. We want to substantially lessen the impacts that we have on water quality. with conventional systems. We want to reduce soil erosion, and we want to build soil carbon. Those first three are particularly, those are the, in my mind, the carrot that will encourage people to do this if we can, in fact, achieve those goals. I'm going to make a little analogy in the next few slides. I hope you'll forgive me. I think of the small scale work that Ken and his students did. Not all of you are old enough to remember these things, but some of you remember the early cell phones. They were bag phones. See them in the front seat of Mercedes-Benz. Look, what we want to do, this project is one goal and three paths. And the first pathway, okay, the overarching goal I've said to you, but I put it here to remind you, perennialize working lands, right? Do it in a way that's profitable. Do it in a way that helps water quality, improves conservation, improves resilience, but is profitable, right? Pathway 1 is to refine that first generation of PGC. I call that Gen 1. We're doing it right now. The materials are commercially available ground covers with commercially available cash crops with existing machinery with on-label herbicides. And the methods there is really to figure out what the best management practices are. Yeah, we've done this on a couple of acres here and there. We are lining up, and really, while we did some experiments this last summer, our first true year of experimentation will be this coming 2023 season. And we are organizing meetings right now to define the details on all of those experiments. But it's essentially to help us better understand the best management practices to make Gen 1 go. It is to accumulate and quantify the ecosystem services being provided, because as many of you will know, there are people out there developing markets to pay farmers for some of those ecosystem services. So if you want to do that, you better know how much of it you're delivering. So we want to make those measurements. Estimate the costs and better quantify the risks. Think about how policy can impact these systems and where there are maybe unintended blocks in policy that we need to be considering. To me, all these things which we're sort of doing right now are like that first Nokia cell phone that many of us had. I had one of these. I miss it some days. It was less distracting than the phone I have now. That's a side comment. Pathway 2 is really the reach for us. It's to prepare the second generation of perennial ground cover. And we're doing research on that from right now. I don't think we're going to be deploying any of that till late in the project year 4 or so. This is now looking at novel materials, easily suppressed ground covers, reduced sensitivity row crops. I mean, what if you had corn that really didn't exhibit that far red response, and you could plant it into the greens at the golf course and it would yield, right? That's kind of crazy, but what if you could do such a thing? Or what if you could do half of that so that you didn't have as high a sensitivity to a little bit of green in the background? That would be a great step. Is there custom or specialized tillage or spray equipment that we could use that would help people do this at scale? And I will tell you that for us, there's a huge focus on breeding in this project as it pertains to Pathway 2 or Gen 2. We will continue with the novel ground covers and modified crops to determine best management practices, to estimate ecosystem services and so on, because we need all of that in our back pocket as we reach the end of this project and are trying to, if appropriate, convince people to do this at scale. The last pathway is to inspire the next generation, the third generation. It's taking place during our project, but the fruits of those efforts are really realized afterward. And that is the people that we're training, who are so important to this project, to develop a constellation of productive, sustainable, and resilient agroecosystems that are based on, novel ground covers that are self-suppressing, or that have, what if we could fly a drone and turn on a UV light and somehow induce suppression on the day that we needed it? Or what if we could develop a nitrogen fixing ground cover, or one that would immobilize nitrogen? There are, I mean, you sit down and start thinking about this, and the possibilities are almost endless. We have to be very careful to try to do all those things. So I'm going to take a breath for a minute. I've been talking at you for close to 23 minutes, I think, 22 minutes. Matt, how are we doing?
Good. We're good on time.
Okay. So I'm going to share with you a couple of underlying beliefs for this system that are, I think, important to understand. The first is that we think this isn't just technically feasible, but potentially economically feasible. That is, that it might be revenue neutral or even revenue positive. This is a slide that Cindy showed you 2 years ago. She has been improving and enhancing the enterprise budget model that she's created for these systems, and we're going to be publishing that shortly. Another belief that we have is that, and I said this earlier, but I want to emphasize that perennial cover is complementary to the row crop. It's not a revenue source, okay? Its role is to provide critical ecosystem services. We are not pursuing grazable ground covers. Here's a fun fact. If you look at the ratio of cropland to pasture land, which is perhaps a proxy, this is for Iowa. This is a proxy for what kind of population of grazing animals you would even have. There are large parts of our state where I hope we would see perennial ground cover introduced, if we can make it work well, that really don't have, I think, the population of grazers necessary to be the system for knocking back the ground cover. So there are people who say, well, why don't you just graze this stuff? And my answer is, well, absolutely. There are probably some corners where we should do that, but we need a system that you can do even if you don't have ruminants nearby. You, I assume, have all heard that there are people working to perennialize cash crops themselves. And I think that's tantalizing, and I think it's really difficult. Our PGC vision offers a pathway to perennialize working lands by partnering a perennial with an annual. And we think that's just a really neat way of getting a perennialization on the landscape while maintaining some of the advantages of annuals. Another belief, I believe that farmers currently doing annual cover cropping will probably be key to us developing the system because they are the early adopters who care about ecosystem services. They want to see these things work. And we have several of them who are helping us think about how to make these systems work better. But here's something funny. They're not our prime target. It's what I have started to call the paradox of the niche, which is if you want to impact this dead zone that I've illustrated here in the Gulf of Mexico, you can't just get there by getting the 4% of farmers or 4% of the acres that are already cover cropping into perennial ground cover. I'm not even sure you get a benefit doing that. You got to get to the 95+% that aren't doing cover cropping. Going back to that image I showed you earlier. Last thing is, and I said this, you could transform agroecosystems with this PGC approach. There are so many iterations, but even with $10 million, we can barely scratch the surface. So in my mind, we are focused on developing approaches relevant to key upper Midwest crops and slightly beyond, such that we can get the risk profile of Gen 1 PGC so similar to business as usual that in 5 years, we have 5% adoption on Iowa corn and soybean acres. That's a crazy high reach. My team knows that's a high reach. We're going to try it anyway. We'll see what happens. I am now into overtime. And so I think that I'm going to tell you very briefly that we've got 5 major objective areas and 4 cross-cutting themes because it's a coordinated agricultural project. And I've got examples that I'm not going to do for you because I want to be fair to the people who schedule this. So we've got strong education. We have some great future impacts we want, but I'm going to just stop and respect the time limits that were set for me. And maybe we'll go to some of the slides later when we're talking. I want to thank you so much for being here today and for your attention. Matt's told us to enter the questions via the chat. I'm going to show you 2 more slides. One of them is to advertise that on Wednesday, October 5th, Vinayak Shedekar and Will Osterholtz will be presenting from the Ohio State University and ARS in Columbus. So please consider attending that. And if you are interested in getting CEU credits, the instructions are here. And I will now take a breath and take questions.
All right. Thanks, Raj. We do have a few questions that have come in. So I get there are a couple somewhat related. But one is, asking the question, are there any concerns about introducing a non-native cool season grass? Are there any trials with native cool season grasses instead? And then there was a question about what about reseeding annuals like crabgrass?
Okay. I can take a swing at certainly the first of those, but I'm going to ask if there's any chance that my friend and colleague on this project, Ken Moore, was able to make it as he said he would. I think, is Ken there? Can somebody tell me?
I thought I saw Ken get on. So yeah, Ken's there. So
I'm here, Raj.
Ken, wonderful. Thank you. I don't have a list of who is here. Ken, would you mind? I was going to joke with people, but I wasn't sure you were going to be here. So now I'll joke with people and say, I make the presentation, and then I leave all the hard questions to Ken, who I'll say nothing more about Ken other than he knows a lot about this system. Ken, do you want to take a swing at that?
Okay. So the first question had to do with native versus introduced.
yes, that's right.
Okay, so when we set out to do this, we tried to develop an idiotype or an ideal set of traits for the perennial ground cover. So when you think about a species that would get along well with corn and soybean, you think of something that's going to grow in the season when they're not growing, like Raj talked about. Spatially, you want something that's very shallow rooted. You want something that's pretty hardy, winter hardy, that will survive and persist under sort of pretty harsh growing conditions. So you come up with a list of those and you try them. So none of the natives really fit that trait profile. They're either too vigorous or they're not capable of existing under those circumstances. And so we've screened, like in the first trial, there were 36 of them, different species as potential ground covers for corn. Several cool season species work. We've chosen to work with Kentucky bluegrass as sort of the model species, primarily because it fits that idiotype really well. The other thing about Kentucky bluegrass is that it may not be native, but it's something everybody's familiar with. It's in almost every lawn in Iowa. You can find it in almost every pasture in Iowa. You can find it on the shelf in almost any hardware store in Iowa. So yeah, that's why we've been working with Kentucky bluegrass. Shuizong Fei in horticulture is working on developing alternative species that have even better traits than Kentucky bluegrass for this. Ultimately, I expect it to be something else, but that's why.
And Matt, I think was the second question
About
crabgrass?
Yep, reseeding annuals like crabgrass.
Yeah, so we have thought about that, and Shuizong has developed a study where he is looking at warm season perennials and reseeding annuals as potential cover crops to sort of avoid the early spring competition that's giving us trouble. So the issue there is that part of the ecosystem services that are provided by the ground cover really have to do with the fact that it's actively growing in the early spring and immobilizing nitrogen and so on. I wouldn't rule out the others, but I think, yeah. Plus, if you're looking at a reseeding grass, you can't always rely on them reseeding effectively every season. Crabgrass probably can, though.
Oh, we don't hear you, Matt.
I always joke around that I want to look at creeping Charlie because I can't get rid of that stuff in my flower beds in the old area.
Matt, my neighbors, that's what their lawn is. It's like I keep telling them, you may not have to apply chemicals, but you're forcing me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Let me see here. A couple other questions here. Any experience to date on the social acceptance of perennial ground cover?
Well, I'll start, and Ken can, if there's, he can correct. We have done as a team, I think about 8 field days in the last year related to this approach. And a couple before that, because Dan Anderson and Ken and myself had a INRC funded project that is doing some perennial ground cover work in Nashua, and we've had field days for that. I would say there's a lot of interest on the part of farmers in the system. They want to know more. I have not seen a pushback on the idea that you're putting a perennial in there. I feel like there's an understanding that, this would be nice if you didn't have to plant every year. There are concerns when you say, if you don't suppress it well, you might have a 20 or 30 or 40% yield loss. That gets people's attention. And then the question of how are you going to, what are you going to use to suppress that? And Ken talked about what Dr. Fay is doing. One of the grasses that Dr. Fay works with is day length sensitive and senesces basically late April in Iowa, just goes brown. And that's wonderful, right? I mean, so again, you might be going, well, if you have that, why aren't you doing this? Well, the answer is it's astronomically expensive. And I think we're still trying to figure out whether it provides all the ecosystem services that the Kentucky bluegrass does. Okay, so there are questions. There's a lot of trade-offs in this system. Farmers are interested. Cautiously, I'm happy. And of course, every so often, there's somebody who says, I want to do this and I want to go big. And then we're cautioning because we don't want people to lose their money because they don't recognize the risk that this system would expose them to. I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Yep. Go to another one. Is there a role for crop insurance in mitigating the risk of crop yield loss from perennial ground cover?
Yes. And Cindy Bartell, who I've already said her name a few times today, is thinking about those issues related to what insurance and what policy implies. Ken, she works closely with Ken, formerly his graduate student. You want to say anything in addition to that, Ken, about what Cindy's doing?
Not really, but in order to be adopted, this has to fit with current or future farm programs, right? And so one way to think about it is combining working lands and conservation programs into a single practice in a field. So I don't think it's too big a stretch to think that it can be adopted as an accepted practice for soil conservation, and then later perhaps be accepted for crop insurance. I mean, you can use annual cover crops now in crop insurance programs, and so I don't see that big a lift to get there with the perennial ground cover once we work out some of the details. Not the best answer, I realize.
Oh, that's a good answer.
Great. The next one is, at what scale has the perennial ground cover been implemented? Just experimental trials or at field scale? I think I know the answer based on the combine I saw in one of those pictures, but yeah.
I'd call it small field scale. I don't remember exactly what size that was. I want to say it was a handful of acres. I know the stuff that the experiments that we are doing at Nashua are 1 acre each, or maybe 0.87 acre. I don't know, and it's funny, this is something I'm working on right now. I would like to have a better inventory of exactly how many acres and what kind of experiment we have across the project and across especially some of our cooperating farmers. It's early days, but ask me in a year and I'll have good numbers for you.
Are you looking for any more cooperating farmers or?
Yes and no. So one of the things we've realized, quite honestly, is that we say cooperating farmer like it's a monolith, but there are different levels of care that we can give people. So we've got some people where we are giving them seed and we're getting out to their fields regularly, and we don't have the people power to do any more of those types of people. And then we've kind of got a scale, and then we've got people who are like, I read about this, I'm going to try it. I mean, yeah, we love anybody to do that as long as they don't go too big, because we don't want them to lose money. And we are actually in process of getting formal verbiage on our website, and I should have put it here, but RegenPGC, the name of this project, .org, Google it, you'll go right to us. We have a pretty nice website at this point, and that website will have a guide for people who want to try it by the end of 2022. I mean, I kind of hope to have it by the end of October. I don't think that's going to happen, but we are working actively to do that. And if you're interested, send me an email, please, and I will put you in touch with our commercialization lead, who is kind of overseeing our farmer landowner advisory group, our FLAG group, and at a minimum, we'll get you on a piece of software where you can talk to other people who are trying this.
Great. So there's another question here, and this is probably a little bit more for Ken, but do you have any experience with little barley? They've had this individual in South Central Indiana has had a thick volunteer stand of that, and it forms quite a thick root mat about 2 to 3 inches deep.
Interesting.
No, but that sounds really interesting to me. I'd like to learn more about that.
Okay, so maybe that person can get in touch with you if they have some interest there.
A minor side note I would make, I didn't really, I was zooming too much and I didn't get time to tell you about this, but we have a cooperator, a co-PD, who's also our research theme leader, who's a scientist at the Land Institute. And Brandon Schlautman has been working with Kura clover as perennial ground cover in systems there. And, you know, to me, actually talking to Brandon and Ken is a reminder that even in the Corn Belt, there are very significant differences in the climate and soil and so on that mean that maybe the one ground cover will not fit all those places. My understanding, and Ken will correct me, my understanding is around here, Kura clover can really be hard to knock back, that it sticks around for a long time. It sounds like Brandon, when he's used this successfully in Kansas and Nebraska, doesn't really have a problem getting it knocked back and doesn't have a problem with it becoming invasive. Just telling you, we've got a bunch of stuff. Matt, yeah.
Yeah, no, we have some experience of it too. And Liz Ripley, her father was one of the first trials of Kura clover in Iowa. We had it at Gilmore City, and we could get it to grow really well. It didn't spread. It didn't spread from our plot, so it wasn't that invasive next to it, but it was fairly competitive with the corn, at least in that case. So there, another question, I think this is maybe getting at what Ken talked about with, and maybe Raj on the work that's going on in horticulture, but they ask if you could expand on that April browning cover that you talked about would be expensive. Is it inherently expensive, or could it be, you know, with sufficient use, be comparable in price to bluegrass, and would it reduce the management costs long term?
I love that question. That's exact. So I don't know if it's any comfort to the person who asked that, but we are asking exactly those questions ourselves. In fact, we had about a 3-hour conversation about this at one of the first face-to-face meetings the team had a chance to do back in April. And I think my answer, as I understand it, is not completely clear. Are there opportunities? So I would say this: Poa bulbosa is being used as a ground cover to provide ecosystem services in orchards and vineyards in the West already, okay? It's very expensive, and undoubtedly you can drive the price down. However, it's bulbule propagating, and I don't know enough about how the machinery and what the cost structure is. I don't know enough to know whether there's a floor on its price that's considerably higher than it would be for Kentucky bluegrass or not. I think it's an interesting sort of techno-economic, agronomic question. But you know, there are, again, when you think about impact, you have to get onto acres in a reasonable amount of time. So there's an interesting question about scalability about that. It absolutely, to the person's point about would it reduce management? Yes. Faye has these trials right out here just on Sorensen Farm where they've got unsuppressed Kentucky bluegrass and unsuppressed POA and corn growing in both of them. And the unsuppressed POA yields are basically similar to controls for year after year. Unsuppressed Kentucky bluegrass, it's not pretty. I mean, that's like, you know, 40+% yield losses. So not that anyone would operate the system that way ever, but it's just interesting. That's how they're doing that particular experiment. Ken, you want to amplify or correct?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the cost of POA can be made substantially less than it is now. You know, there's just one seed company, and they have proprietary rights to the process for hybridizing accessions of POA bulbosa. But you know, it's a matter of scale. I think it can get it down. I don't know what the actual cost would be, but I think it could be, right now it's like what, $1,000 an acre, but you know, it needs to get down to like 40 an acre. So yeah. What was the second question? Sorry.
I think that would it reduce the long-term management costs?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've gotten through all the questions and kind of being respectful of everyone's time, including Dr. Raman and Dr. Moore. I want to thank them for Raj's presentation and Ken being willing to jump on and help answer some questions. That was awesome. We got, you know, like double duty. So now if you are on for a CCA CEU and you're still with us, email Elena Whitaker, Elena WALENAW at iState.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name and the name you entered to watch the webinar, if different, and your CCA number. With that, thank you again, Raj and Ken, for the great work and also for presenting today. And I hope that we can count on you to come and present updates as you go along.
That'd be an
And if
honor.
we can help in any way, let us know.